Welcome into KSL Sports Facebook page. We are your Utah Utes insiders. Trevor Allen right here. Tom Hackett just below me right there. I am the host of the Crimson Corner podcast. Tom is the host of It's Utah's World podcast. And we just got off of a Zoom conference call with Utah Athletics Director Mark Harlan, Deputy AD Kyle Brennan, and also a couple of Utah physicians and trainers, just talking about how they're going to reopen the athletic facilities moving forward. And so, Tom, first off, we know now that June 15th, which is when the Pac-12 announced when schools will be allowed to start doing voluntary workouts, Utah's going to follow along those guidelines, but they're going to be a little more strict than maybe some other schools are as far as what they're going to do to keep athletes safe.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating conversation, but it was good to be informed by the powers that be up there on the Hill. Mark Harlan, the athletic director, Kyle Brennan, the assistant AD, who I believe has been kind of taking charge of all of this and trying to construct and put the teams together. And he's been the go-to man. I think Mark's dedicated Kyle that role. And then, of course, Trevor Jamison, I should say, longtime employee up there. And Dr. Petron, who's also been around for quite some time. He's the leading orthopedic surgeon / specialist who pays very close attention to the athletes anytime they need some assistance, and is of course very, very good at what he does. So hearing from those guys as to kind of the phases, and then of course for the media to be able to ask questions, Trevor, regarding what happens if a student athlete tests positive. What sort of testing will they conduct? What sort of protocols and procedures and regulations are in place for the athletes to best assure their safety? I know you did a write-up that we're looking at right now on KSLSports.com, kind of debriefing everybody that, of course, was unable to be on the call as it was only media members allowed, kind of what the latest is when it comes to Utah athletics and the student athletes and coaches, for that matter. Coaches will be tested as well, which I think is obviously a much needed and essential part of the process. But, Trev, I thought what was interesting, and I don't know how you kind of wanted to get this conversation going, but I'm curious because they're not going to test for COVID-19 when the student athletes and coaches return to the facilities. They'll instead test for antibodies, which will give them, I guess, some indication as to whether or not student athletes have had COVID-19 without knowing it. The whole asymptomatic thing can occur, and so they're not going to test for COVID-19. They're going to test for antibodies, which is interesting because there have been a fair bit of criticism towards those antibody tests as false negatives. A number of them seemingly have been occurring throughout the world and throughout the United States, but that was the procedure that Dr. Petron decided would be best for the athletic department. Were you surprised by that at all?
Oh, no, I wasn't shocked by it. I mean, I'm just really pleased with how they're handling this, and that they're being pretty strict about it, which is a great thing. It keeps the student athletes safe. It seems like that they've been in a lot of meetings to look forward to this and really talking to a lot of health experts about this. And I just think it's going to be something that is going to be really big for Utah. Now, the fact that, Tom, I kind of want to ask you with all of these guidelines that they're actually putting forth, and if you folks out there want to go check out the story, it's a lot of detail in there. But if you were to have to go through some of these protocols, procedures when you were playing at Utah, what would you think about it? Would you want to stay home and work out, or would you be okay going through all of this if you can go back on campus and work out?
Well, I guess I've been pretty open publicly about my lack of desire to work out, and that was probably the beginning of the end for my punting and football career, now that I have had some time to look back on it. But I'm under the impression, Trevor, I think every individual, every student athlete, every coach, every key personnel up there on the Hill is allowed to have their own say. And I think it depends on certain situations, quite frankly. I think for me personally, I'm fortunate. I'm a healthy 28-year-old now who does not have any underlying health issues. I'm not overweight. I don't struggle with diabetes. Like I just don't have any severe health concerns that I personally would be fearful of. So I would return if I was still playing, and I would love all of the protocols that they currently have in place. I love how they've been able to orchestrate that because although I feel comfortable returning, I would still like to be reassured that they are doing everything in their power to make sure that the student athletes and everybody else involved's health and safety is a priority. Now, with that said, it'll be fascinating because I can guarantee you, Trevor, and I can't talk for other teams necessarily, but I know from a football standpoint, right, the concept of voluntary workouts, it doesn't exist. There's no such thing for football players. And it's not just at the University of Utah. This is across the entire country. Summer workouts are technically voluntary workouts. They're not. They're not at all. If you don't show up to them, your playing time will just randomly, diminish before your eyes. So I don't know if that's going to change. I really do hope it does because I just think there are going to be individuals out there, student athletes, that have a lot of concern, whether they struggle with asthma themselves, any sort of respiratory disease or illness that they've had issues with in the past, or maybe they have family members that are of high risk. And so I can guarantee you that there will be student athletes up there on the Hill and across the entire country that will have their concerns and might not feel safe returning to practice facilities. And I just hope that the coaches of those players respect those individuals and allow them the extra time and come to an agreement as to how they can make it all work. But I am certainly fearful of that because I know from previous and past experiences, there really is no such thing as voluntary workouts up there in the footballing world. So I don't know. It's gonna be interesting. And if teams and coaches and athletic directors and athletic departments, for that matter, if they're not careful, they could find themselves in a fair bit of scrutiny from the public eye if any of that does get out. But for now, I'm confident that the University of Utah will handle all of this well. It seems like they've done a bunch of research. Trevor, I should say, mentioned that this has been 4 weeks in the works for this specific guideline, whatever you want to call it. They started this 4 weeks ago, and that's where they've ended up now.
So, something that I've noticed is that, that when media started asking questions, they were going a little bit away from reopening from all this news and, all the phases and all that. And they were asking, I know there were some questions about college football and, whether, the season, if there will be a season and things like that. I felt like that it was good that Utah stayed on the task at hand and that it was based off of what they were going to do to keep all their student athletes safe. And they have it really well thought out, Tom. I mean, we looked at this and, part of it is that, so it's going to begin on the 15th of next month with all in-state student athletes. Football, men's basketball, women's basketball, gymnastics, volleyball, and soccer will be allowed to work out on campus. And again, this is all voluntarily. It's not, they don't have to be there, and they're going to do it in small groups. And there's a whole other thing for it. And then phase 2 is going to begin on the 22nd of next month with out-of-state student athletes for those same sports. And then phase 3 will get underway June 23rd with all new student athletes that are housing dependent for football, men's basketball, and all those. And then they'll start phasing in all of the sports athletes beginning after phase 3 when the department's going to go back and reevaluate everything.
Worth noting too, Trevor, that it was mentioned upon arrival, student athletes will be working out in very small groups. Some will be working out independently. I guess that kind of varies based on the team you compete for. And then depending on how all of that goes, and of course they're going to segregate teams. So, back in the day, pre-pandemic, you would share cafeteria space and what have you with other other teams up there on the hill. That won't take place anymore. It'll be all segregated. So you'll spend time, if you spend time with anybody, with people from your same team. So football players with football players, soccer players with soccer players, so on and so forth. But also worth noting that it's going to be kind of like a 3-week trial period, I guess, is how they explained it. So they'll start with small group activities with the in-state guys, let the out-of-state guys come in, small group. That'll take place 3 weeks, and they'll kind of go back, hit the brainstorming table, and kind of review how it all went down. Was it successful? Was it not? And based on the first 3 weeks of practice, they will then determine as to whether or not they can start opening things up to a little more leniency, I guess, and allow bigger groups to take place. Because, of course, we know, Trevor, if there is going to be a football season, the football team's going to have to practice as a whole. That's 120-odd players that are going to have to get out, surround each other, slap each other on the backside, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, I just don't see how football goes ahead.
Yeah, you're not really able to stay 6 feet apart when you're trying to tackle somebody, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Punters can.
Well,
right?
Punters shouldn't have to tackle anybody in the first place.
No. Punters should be able to stay, be able to social distance.
This is true. Yeah, no. In fact, Trevor, we've been social distancing really for our entire lifetime. So this is nothing new to me. People ask how quarantine's going, how's being alone, Tom, and I say, well, my friend, as a former punter, I've been practicing this for quite some time. Don't come near me. I smell.
Yeah. Which is, I guess, why we're not back in the office, for one of the reasons at least.
Right.
No. But really, and then, Tom, something else that I'm wanting to point out is that this will not include team practices, organized team activities, and players will not be working out with their coaches.
Right.
So I want fans out there to realize that this does not mean that, the floodgates open and that they're going to bring, everyone together and they're going to start working out and they're going to start practicing. This is just voluntary workouts, and they're phasing them in, beginning with the in-state people. But then also something of what they're going to be doing prior to even working out, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where it's kind of strict, which is good. Again, I'm not trying to diminish that. I think it's absolutely fantastic. But all student athletes who are going to be back on campus are going to get tested,
right,
for COVID-19, and then each individual will be tested for antibodies as well, and will have their temperatures checked daily, and will have symptoms evaluated every day, and especially during that 2-week period when you get back on campus is when that all starts too. But then they're also having all of the athletes who are working out together stay 6 feet apart, wearing masks, things like that. And they're also going to be cleaning all the equipment all the time, it sounds like. And that one of the things too that we actually noticed in there is that all student athletes, coaches, and staff will be subject to COVID-19 protocols and standards. No exceptions is what they put on that slide.
Correct.
Too. So they're really putting the hammer down.
They are. Yeah, no, they'll have a questionnaire that you can throw in there for them to answer. I imagine the questions will include something along the lines of kind of where you've been staying, who you've been staying with, have you or anybody that you have come in close contact with over the past 3 months been exposed to the virus, so on and so forth, and then of course temperature checks and you name it. They're taking all the protocols, which is good. Trev, what they're doing is essentially establishing a stricter guideline, stricter protocols than what the state government's issuing here locally. And that's based on kind of the Pac-12 document that was released the other day. Now you have to remember that the Pac-12 consists of 12 teams, and some of those teams, such as USC, UCLA, the guys up there in Northern California as well. So Stanford's and Cal's and what have you, they are in hotspots for COVID-19, kind of big metropolitan areas that include millions upon millions upon millions of people. And of course, it's much harder to try and keep everybody safe in that sense. Out here in Utah, we're fortunate. We have about 3 million people in the state, and for the most part, the public has been following the guidelines set by Governor Herbert and Dr. Angela Dunn and those that have been speaking frequently to the public, trying to help everybody out. People have been listening, so Utah's done a good job in that sense, and so it's kind of a mess. I think when you really break it down and think about it, it just Utah seems to be good, but then you've got other schools that aren't in a good place, and they have to be incredibly skeptical and somewhat pessimistic, if you will. So I don't know how it's all going to work out. I don't know how the college football season's potentially going to start on time. It just seems like we're still so far away, and there are still so many phases, Trevor, that all of these teams, not only Utah, need to manage through.
Yeah, and really, as you look at this, if all the phases go as planned, I mean, we're talking through the first 6 phases, that will leak all the way into the end of July. And then phase 7, that is where students are supposed to be going back on campus, and that's where they are all required to go back to campus. That is August 24th, because it says with all student athletes back on campus. Now, the first 6 phases are all for student athletes, but now, Tom, I know that Mark Harlan wasn't able to talk or didn't talk about it. I know he's talked about it in the past, but after seeing of what we're seeing now with this, I know BYU is opening up some of, allowing some of their athletes to work out and things like that. Is the college football season going to happen this fall?
I think it will. I just have such a hard time seeing it start on time because, the days are dwindling, and the weeks are going by faster and faster. And so it just seems so hard for me to wrap my head around how that's all going to take place. There are so many more steps that need to occur. And, I don't have the answer as to when it's going to happen. And look, I sure hope it does happen on time. I sure hope the BYU-Utah games take place up at Rice Circle Stadium on September 3rd. I'm an advocate for that. But at the same time, I don't want anything to be rushed. I want the health and safety of everybody involved to be paramount. And so I'm rooting for everybody, but there are here's one of the big things for me, Trev, that I mentioned earlier, there are about 120 football players on any given college football team. To put that into perspective, by the way, 53 players make every year's NFL roster. So it's more than double an NFL team. A lot of people on a college football team. Then you include the coaches, the staff, the equipment staff, the training staff. There's got to be at least 200 people that operate inside of any given football facility at any given time. The odds, and I don't want to sound too negative and too pessimistic, but the odds that somebody, one of those 200 people, with how much interaction they'll inevitably have, the chances are somebody's going to test positive for COVID-19.
At least one. I mean, you look at that, think. 200 people, one person out of 200. Yeah, I mean that the odds are pretty good for that. But I still think, Tom, that the season could start on time, because what were you doing when you were playing at Utah at the end of May? Even though it wasn't a world pandemic.
Right.
I mean, you guys just finished up spring ball, right? And then you guys are now working, summer workouts, and camp's not supposed to start till August. Now, if something's starting to, like, if we're not trending in the right way come August, then yeah, you have to think about maybe moving the season back to October, November.
But it's just, the chances are there's going to be no vaccine by the time college football season starts. So, and like I was saying earlier, if at least one person tests positive, that'll prolong phases and events, substantially, because then you have to kind of go back to ground zero and phase 1 and start, and part of the problem is, people can be asymptomatic. So people can carry the virus, Trev, as we know, it's been well documented. People can carry the virus and not even know they have it. Whereas, then they transfer it to somebody else, and for whatever reason, they get hit with it, and then they can feel it. They have a hard time breathing, they get a dry cough, and all of that. And so if one person gets it, that'll prolong things, I think, personally, substantially. But here's hoping that doesn't occur. And the Utah football team, along with all the other sports that will be returning on June 15th, stay safe and healthy. I do trust, and I do have a lot of faith, I must say, Trev, in just the training staff, the cleaning crews, the janitors, everybody that's going to be employed to maintain the health and safety of the student athletes. I do think they will do everything in their power and some to ensure that the student athletes and coaches will have their health put at a paramount. But I don't know. It's going to be interesting. I'll say that. We should touch on, Trev, what would happen if a student athlete were to test positive.
I was actually just going to bring that up. But yeah, so what it sounds like is that if there is a student athlete during this process that test positive, they will then put them. They'll be in quarantine for at least. I think it said that what they're going to do is test them during day 3 and day 5. If they're negative on both of those tests, then they'll be allowed to go back to work out. But they're going to remove them from that group if they do test positive, and then but the others will still work out, but they're going to monitor them closely to see if they get the virus or whatever, or if they were exposed. So that's kind of where it is right now. But if they do get it, and then even after day 3 and 5 test positive still, then they'll be in quarantine for 14 days away from everybody. They won't be allowed back on campus until then.
Right. Worth also noting that if they're in-state guys, they have family members within the state. The university will have conversations with the family members to see if it's okay if they go home, spend time with their family, quarantined in the basement, in their room, wherever it may be. If they're from out of state, it's a bit trickier, but they've already set up locations on campus. And they didn't go into specifics, but I imagine maybe like dorm rooms or a hotel room or something, isolated is where they'll put it. So they do have space on campus if a student athlete tests positive for the virus. If they're from the state of Utah, then they could potentially go home to their parents.
There's 2 more things I want to bring up, and then I'll cut you loose, Tom. And one of them is, and it's been widely talked about, is that student athletes, it's a little bit different as far as having them come back with, a risk of getting the virus compared to, being a pro athlete, because they're grown adults, they're out on their own, things like that. They can make their own choices. With student athletes, that's not the case. You still have to have parents involved. Could that have a hamper on some of these student athletes, just depending on how certain parents are?
Certainly, and that's part of the reason why earlier in the broadcast I was talking about, coaches and the entire athletic department have to be very sincere and very careful with their approach. If a student athlete does not feel comfortable returning to the practice facility for whatever reason, it actually doesn't even matter what the reason may be, then coaches and athletic departments must adhere to their requests. They have no option, because the world we live in currently, Trev, is one that the power of social media, the power of getting your name heard or your voice heard is high. And for a subject matter like this, that'll break the internet, or at least it'll break the local internet here in Salt Lake City. If somebody on the University of Utah football team, soccer team, women's volleyball team, whatever it is, if they're essentially forced to return to their practice facilities when they do not feel comfortable doing so, then the entire athletic department and university will be ridiculed for it. So it's unprecedented times. There's no doubt about it. And I think the athletic department, the feeling I get is that they are handling the situation as best as they can. But, it's unprecedented waters for them, just as it is for you and I and everybody else that surrounds us here in the local community. So I just hope that everything works out. I have good faith that it will. And it's a tricky situation. That's the bottom line. Is we're talking about a virus that is for the most part pretty scary and has killed a number of people throughout the world and here in North America. And there is no vaccine. And people can have the virus, and the people that have the virus may not even know they have the virus, which really adds another element to the whole thing. But you've got to start making inroads somewhere, and this seems to be a start, Trevor. I guess overall, were you content with the presentation put on by the athletic department this afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, it was very thorough, and something that I love that Harlan talked about was that he wanted to be transparent with us, the media, in how they were going to do this whole phase-in process. And a lot of schools, and programs out there are just gonna be like, well, you'll just find out when you find out. But the fact that they put this together, invited all the media on this Zoom call, and then showed us a PowerPoint presentation, to me, and it was very detailed on what what all the information was, and that's where a lot of this comes from in this story that all of you will read over at kslsports.com. But you don't get that everywhere, Tom. I mean, there are certain schools that are just gonna be like, yeah, we're just gonna open it with this. But the fact that they're gonna say this is why we're doing it, this is how safe we're gonna be, we're following all these guidelines and protocols, this is how we're gonna do it. But then something else that I, wanted to bring up too, that kind of ties in with the whole parent thing, Tom, is that there are schools out there right now that are already talking about where the ADs are saying that if there's a student athlete that doesn't feel comfortable competing or working out on campus or anything like that, their scholarship is not in jeopardy. And now was something that, Harlan was asked. He said that he's not really going to address that right now. But do you have a feeling that that's going to kind of be the same thing with Utah? Is that they're going to go kind of that same route as other schools are, where they're not gonna jeopardize your scholarship or anything, or give it away or pull it if you're not going to compete?
I think they have to. I don't see another alternative. Personally,
other than them just saying, well, we're going to pull your scholarship if you're not going to compete, which just doesn't sound right.
No, and then you're kind of opening things up to certain civil rights cases, lawsuits. It doesn't seem humane. Maybe more importantly, and of course we've touched on this, but every single individual is separate and entitled to their own decision. Like I was saying earlier, for me personally, I'm comfortable for the most part. If I were to play right now, I've got a new 3.5-month-old. I'm not nearly as comfortable as I would have been if I was 25 with a girlfriend, no kids, no real worries in the world. I wouldn't care. But if I had parents, for example, that lived in state that I would frequent every week, and let's say my mother or father was asthmatic and didn't have the healthiest of respiratory systems, then yeah, I'm going to be pretty skeptical, and I'm probably going to raise my hand and give my coach a call and just say, hey, here's the situation. Here's the situation. I don't feel comfortable. You've got to respect it. You've got to also understand that I would love nothing more than to come back and work out. But, it is just a game. And at the end of the day, the health and safety of my parents takes precedence. And that's kind of how I'm going to operate. So I hope you can understand and trust that I'll continue to work out, stay in the best shape possible. But I just don't feel comfortable going back to work. That's going to be interesting.
And that's why we go back to what you're saying. Everybody's different.
Right.
People parent differently. You and I each have kids. You and I are not the same parent. We each have different values that we have and things like that, and ways that we go about life and things that what we want for our kids. And so it's all going to be different. But I do think that Utah has the leadership and is set up well to be able to handle anything that really comes their way.
Yeah, I think that was made pretty evident during the broadcast earlier this afternoon. And again, Trev, I think the only way to end this conversation, as much fun as it has been, would just be to hope that it all works out. We don't know what the future holds, but it seems pretty clear that the university, as expected, has put a ton of time, effort, and resources towards constructing a guideline for their student athletes to return in a safe manner. And we just hope that for the most part, it all goes smoothly. There's inevitably going to be some hiccups along the way. But as we all learn, continue to grow, and continue to try and stay sane in houses, then I think it'll all work out eventually. But boy, I hope there's college football come September 3rd, fans or not.
We need it. We need it big time. Well, Tom, it's always good to catch up with you. Again, for fans out there, head over to KSLSports.com. The story is right there regarding Utah Athletics opening up their facilities for voluntary workouts, phasing it in beginning June 15th. For all of your coverage of the Utes, head over to KSLSports.com. Follow Tom and I on Twitter. I'm at Trevor Sports. Tom is at Tom Can't Hackett, and also at KSL Sports on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Tom, thanks, man.
Thanks, dude. Hey, big shout out to University Federal Credit Union as well, Trev.
Absolutely.
Thanks for sponsoring.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, guys.